Welcome to the Sharp Angles Prop and DFS show for week 3 of the NFL playoffs. I am your host, Tod Burros, and I am joined by both Ryan McCrystal, who's going to give us props by position. Since with only 2 games, we thought it was best to go by position and not by game. And Adam Wilde, our showdown expert, will also join us, and he and I will take you through early DFS thoughts. But first, we still have 2 more weeks to make money in betting in DFS, and the props are coming fast and furious. Let us help you do that with our postseason package, which gives you Warren Sharp's betting recommendations and Rich Rebar's outstanding game reviews. Use the promo code 75OFF for 75% off our weekly postseason plan. Go to sharpfootball.com and sign up now. Also, if you could please subscribe and give the thumbs up on our YouTube channel or give us a nice review wherever you listen to podcasts, we would greatly appreciate it. Guys, welcome to the show.
Hey.
It is becoming a regular occurrence that the 3 of us get together, and I am excited about this week. And I am excited about this show. As I mentioned, we are going to go position by position. It made a lot more sense. Ryan suggested it, and I think he was absolutely right. And normally we start with the quarterback position, but I'm going to start us off with the running back position due to the fact that Christian McCaffrey is the most important decision on the slate. Last week, when he was due for 45% ownership, and Adam rightly thought he would be about 10% higher. This week, he's showing 60 to 65% early ownership and 70 or more percent in smaller field stuff. So I will ask Adam about that. But first, let's get Ryan's prop at the running back position, which actually happens to be about one Christian McCaffrey. Ryan, what do you got for us?
Yeah, going right into it with a Christian McCaffrey prop, and maybe I'll disappoint those who are excited about rostering him this week, because I'm actually going to be on the under for his receiving yards. This number is available at 37.5, which is a pretty high number. He's topped this only twice in his last 8 games, and both of those overs were aided by a single reception of 30 or more yards. And obviously that's a rare occurrence. You're never going to bet on a running back having a explosive play to that degree. Another factor in this game, just the 49ers are favored by a touchdown. So game flow is probably going to reduce his pass game workload. And yet this prop is 7 yards higher than it has been at any point in his last 6 games. Now, the reason for that, of course, is the questionable status of Deebo Samuel. As of now, it sounds like he's probably going to play, but it's apparent that he's not healthy. So even if he goes out there, you're getting a lesser version of Deebo Samuel. So, this applies to this prop a little bit. It'll come up in some other ones that I'll mention later. I'm sort of going into this weekend assuming that whether he takes the field or not, we're sort of expecting them to have to adjust their offense to cover some of his workload. Now, you might think that would lead me to take the over on Christian McCaffrey, and I think that's why this number has risen, because the expectation is, well, if McCaffrey's out, or if Deebo's out, McCaffrey can step into some of that role. And to a degree, that's true. I'll show some numbers to back that up, but I'm pretty skeptical in this particular game because of the Lions coverage scheme. They, as we talked about last week, they're one of the teams that plays single high coverage at a pretty high rate. They're 59% on the year, and teams use single high coverage at even higher rates against San Francisco because they're such a run heavy team that you want to stack the box. So you're more likely to be in single high coverage if you're getting extra defenders into the box. In fact, San Francisco has faced single high coverage at the second highest rate, 65%. So a team like the Lions that already plays it at a high rate, I think we can bank on them being right around that 60% mark as they have been. And it could go up to 75, 80%. And looking at McCaffrey's numbers, I don't think that this really benefits him at all. Against single high coverage on the year as in its entirety, he's seen a 15% target share. That's 4th on the team. And when he's on the field, when Deebo is not on the field against single high coverage, McCaffrey's target share is 13%. Actually drops a little bit. I think that's a negligible difference. So dealing with a slightly smaller sample size. But point being, it doesn't change how they use him in single coverage. He's not a focal point of the offense in any way against that. Now, against too high coverage, 21% target share on the year, second highest on the team. Debo leads the team. And so when Debo comes off the field, McCaffrey jumps up to the team lead at 28%. So there are certainly matchups where you would pivot to McCaffrey and think that he's going to see a huge volume. But given the fact that the Lions are a team that already uses a lot of single high coverage, teams tend to up their usage of single high coverage against the 49ers. I think we're going to see it at such a high rate that we shouldn't think that McCaffrey's usage in the passing game is any different than any other week with Debo, with or without Debo. So given the fact that this line has gone up significantly with Debo's expected absence or limited play, I think it's a great opportunity to bet the under, because we should probably be leaning under, even if we're back down at 30 yards where it has been most of recent weeks.
Yeah, and then you also got to consider, and this will also go into what Adam and I talk about in a minute. I mean, he literally was sitting there with a stim gun on his calf during the game last week. So yeah, I think that the under makes sense. Adam, last week you said that you would either be 100% or 0% on CMC. I ended up at about 40. So I went for slightly under. And so I think it was something Adam Levitan said on his pod that really made me not want to go with the heavy fade. And that was that it's much harder to fade someone at running back. There's less volatility. There's less options. But how did you end up last week? Did you end up at 0 or 100 or somewhere in between?
So quick fun fact first, he had 12 targets last week, 7 receptions, and hit the under. So that was a pretty interesting note. But I ended up only playing Showdown last week. I changed my mind last minute, so I played all 4 Showdown games. But I was 100% on Christian McCaffrey, heavy in the captain, and it worked out pretty well.
Awesome. That is good to hear for your pocketbook. So with that in mind, and him now up to 60, 65, 70%, what are your thoughts on Christian McCaffrey this week? I mean, the value, when you look at, every site will give you a projection and then the value versus his salary. I mean, his value is so much higher than anyone else on the slate. You can see why his ownership is going to be that high, but it's very, very difficult, as we've talked about the last couple of weeks, to go over on a guy, 80, 90%, even 100%. You're not getting that much leverage. What's your thoughts?
So you were right to make this the first topic. I mean, this is the first decision that you're going to have to make on the slate. Let's say he's got like a 75% chance of being in the optimal lineup, and his ownership's going to be around 70-ish%. I personally just make that a 2-game slate, and I'll tell you why. You have so few options at running back. Let's just say that Justice Hill scores the same as Christian McCaffrey, because Christian McCaffrey's not scoring a 0 under any circumstance. So let's say unless injury, of course. So let's say a bad game for Christian McCaffrey, he scores 14. Justice Hill also scores 14. Well, you also have 70% of the lineups going against you that, yes, you gained leverage against some of the field, but there's also going to be better lineups than yours that you have to compete against as well, since 70% of the field, almost enough to where you couldn't even cash without having him, is how much Christian McCaffrey is going to be rostered, whether he scores well or not. So it's very, very difficult to find that margin. Like you said, like Adam Levitan said, at running back, that margin would have to be massive to really make a difference if you went Justice Hill and Jahmyr Gibbs instead of Christian McCaffrey, because there's not enough wide receivers to counteract that. I mean, the only wide receiver that really has a good shot of outscoring Christian McCaffrey is Amon-Ra St. Brown. Other than that, we don't have a ton of options at wide receiver either to make it so that you can pay for 2. Right. To make it so you can pay for 2 running backs or pay down for 2 running backs and up for 3 wide receivers. Well, you don't have 3 wide receivers to pay up for. So it just makes it almost impossible. I think it's not fun and it's not sexy to just lock Christian McCaffrey and make it an 8-man slate, but it's going to leave you a lot more time to make other decisions. And there's so many other places that we'll be able to leverage if you just lock in Christian McCaffrey, and you're really not going to have to worry about him one way or the other. unless he gets injured, of course.
Yeah, and so I'll throw an idea out at you that isn't on the show sheet. I just thought of it. So, what if you went 90% Christian McCaffrey and 10% Elijah
Yes.
Mitchell?
Yeah, especially in the Millie Maker. I've seen I saw a Millie Maker where Marcus Mariota won somebody $1 million when Derek Carr got a concussion. It is a very, very common practice for people playing the Millie Maker to play backups. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, whatever percentage you think of, you play Christian McCaffrey, that's one way that you can differentiate by every lineup that doesn't have him. You really leveraging, if he got hurt.
Yeah, smart.
Another way you could do it, and kind of giving a spoiler at the wide receiver, is to just lock in Brandon Aiyuk at 100% and say, all right, and have Christian. And I don't think you have the ability on a 2-game slate for a 0 on Christian McCaffrey like you slate, right? I think, maybe you go down to 20, 30%. But we'll get into this more as we get into the other positions. Let's talk a little bit more about running back. Gus Edwards is the lowest owned at 20% of the starters. Justice Hill is ahead of him. Are there any Hail Mary types that you would even consider decent ownership on? CEH, Dalvin Cook, and as I mentioned, Elijah Mitchell.
No, what you really have to do on 2-game slates is almost just pick somebody that you don't like and fade them, and then just roll with the other 3 options. If you lock Christian McCaffrey, then that makes it easier. But it's really difficult, to just pick a bunch of running backs. I'd rather pick just a couple running backs or just a few running backs, and that's actually how you get leverage. It's almost flipped from what it would be on a larger slate. So what I would probably do is just play none of the Ravens backs and get my narrow player pool that way. And then I would also probably do a just one for the Detroit running backs. But you could do the old 2 running back here and play a running back in the flex and play both Detroit backs because running back's pretty slim on this slate.
Yeah, and I don't like that as much against San Francisco. It would imply that they were pretty far ahead.
Well, the total's 51, though. I mean, they have to score a lot of points. I know the spread's 7,
Okay.
but that's a pretty high total. I mean, I agree with you, but David Montgomery's getting his points by falling in the end zone. So if he does do that, I'm not saying that he definitely will, but David Montgomery's, 12 to 13 points usually come from falling into the end zone. So then your Jahmyr Gibb points are coming from, hey, we need to be competitive with the 49ers and a 51-point over-under.
Yep. All right, Ryan, any thoughts on what we've talked about at the running back position?
No, not too much. I mean, I would just add that with the Ravens running backs, you always have, the Chiefs defense, like we've talked about in the past, is certainly vulnerable to big plays. Maybe that makes you lean towards Justice Hill. He's a little bit more explosive. So if he breaks off a 40-yard touchdown run or something like that, that could give you a big boost there potentially. But of course, with Ravens running backs, as always, you're dealing with, split carries and trying to figure out how that gets divvied up. And that's its own challenge.
Yeah, Craig Reynolds scored last week, but it was his only carry of the game. It's really hard to count on him because I like backups who are 1 injury away from a big role, right?
Mm-hmm.
Craig Reynolds is 2 injuries away from a big role. So any thoughts on Craig Reynolds?
Well, there had to be meaning behind that touchdown. I was thinking about that at the time, but that's not going to happen again. I mean, he didn't score. I don't think he scored all season, which is why it was very strange that he took a Montgomery carry. I mean, there had to have been something going on. Maybe Montgomery's shoe came off. I don't really know, but that's all intents and purposes. That's a David Montgomery touchdown. It's going to be a David Montgomery touchdown this week if the same scenario arises. So that's kind of what I'm getting at is even though it was Craig Reynolds last week, that's going to be a David Montgomery touchdown 99% of the time.
All right, let's move over to the quarterback position. Ryan, you have a prop for us with Lamar Jackson. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'm going to be on the over on his passing yards, which might be slightly counterintuitive given that they're favorites in this game. I should mention the line's at 207 yards right now. There's been some fluctuation both up and down with that line. But I would play it at almost anywhere up to 215 or so, even if it keeps rising. I expect this to be a close game. And if it's a close game, even if the Ravens are leading throughout, I think they're going to have to throw the ball at a decent rate. And we've seen that in close games, Lamar Jackson consistently clears this number. He's been held under 220 yards 9 times this year. So obviously, it's happened where he's had these low output passing games, but 8 of those 9 times he was under 220. It was a double-digit Ravens victory. Now that's on the table. I don't think it would shock people, but they're favored by 4 points. I think it's going to be a relatively close game. I don't think that they're capable of just completely blowing the Chiefs out of this game to limit Lamar Jackson's passing. So this is why it's one of my favorite props, because in those close games, in losses or wins by single digits, there have been 6 of those games for the Ravens, and Lamar Jackson has cleared 220 yards in 5 of those 6 games. So that's why I say it's at 207 now. I've seen it up to the 2 teens. You could keep betting it up even if it goes over, because we've got a pretty strong number there right around 220 where he consistently clears that in these types of games, assuming it's a close one again. And I think the Kansas City coverage scheme is also a factor here. Kansas City, as we've talked about in the past, they're a 2-high safety team at one of the highest rates in the league. However, they will adjust against very run-heavy teams like the Ravens and against mobile quarterbacks, also the Ravens. So that checks both their boxes. So I think they're going to shift away from their typical defense, one that they're most comfortable in, and play a lot of single high in an effort to stack the box and get more athletes closer to Lamar Jackson to spy on him. And we saw this happen. We've seen this happen a few times this year. 3 of their 4 highest rates of cover 1, which is a preferred single high coverage formation. 3 of their 4 highest rates of cover 1 were against Justin Fields, Josh Allen, Russell Wilson, 3 of the most athletic quarterbacks they face this year. And with Justin Fields, their single high coverage rate was up at 55%. Basically, they flipped their coverage on its head. They're usually at 55 to 60% too high against the Bears, a run heavy team with an athletic quarterback like the Ravens. They were trying to stack the box and get athletes into the box as much as possible. So how does this help Jackson? Kansas City is not very good in cover 1. They allow 7.4 yards per attempt when they're in their cover 1 defense, 5.1 yards per attempt in all other coverage schemes. So Baltimore's scheme basically forces them into their worst defense. Now, Lamar Jackson against cover 1, 9.6 yards per attempt, that ranks 4th in the league. Against all other coverage schemes, 7.6 yards per attempt, that ranks 10th in the league. So he's effective everywhere, but he's been particularly good against these cover 1 defenses. So I think this just shapes up to be a really bad matchup for the Kansas City defense. And even if the Ravens are playing with a lead and it suppresses the pass volume a little bit, the potential is there for some big plays because Kansas City has just struggled in this defense that we should anticipate them playing.
It's interesting because, you've gone a couple weeks in a row talking about the Chiefs' bad run defense. So when I saw, I quickly looked at your props and I saw Lamar Jackson and I just assumed it was the run over. Like I didn't look at the actual prop, but now that you've laid it out, it does make a ton of sense. And that's why Ryan is a goat, in this kind of stuff. Really, really great breakdown on that, Ryan. I like it a lot. And I still think Lamar will run because what we've seen, is these running quarterbacks who, as they get older, they save them during the season, but in the playoffs, running is on the table. So that helped me a lot as we talk about the DFS portion of this. So, Adam, ownership is pretty spread out with all 4 of the quarterbacks kind of between 20 to 30% ownership. Are you, let's take kind of a bigger view first. You've talked about taking one guy and going all in on him, or 2 guys, like 70-30, but that's on a bigger slate. On a slate like that, is your general strategy to go one quarterback or the 70-30? I doubt highly you're looking to play all four of these guys.
No, absolutely not. I personally would only play 100% of one quarterback that I've already decided on, but you could make the argument to play both quarterbacks in the San Francisco and Detroit game, as the total is 51. Not only is the total 51, but it's 6.5 points higher than the other game, and I think that other game is actually a candidate to go under. So Vegas kind of made that decision for us, but you could potentially go 70-30 in that game. I would stick with just one on a 2-game slate.
Yeah, and another way, and this goes for a variety of things. This is something that I started doing that I didn't do in the regular season, is if there's two guys I want to play, and let's say I'm maxing the $3 and the $1, and I also max the 50 center, right? Because I like messing around with the optimizer and keeping it in a budget. What I've started doing is, like, let's say I want to, I don't know if I want 100% or 0 of McCaffrey. What I'll do is I'll pick one contest to go all in on and another contest to be all out on. And that way, you're gaining as much leverage while still having a balanced portfolio. Your thoughts on that strategy?
I think that's totally fine. It depends on your comfort level with risk and what you're trying to do. I mean, if you're trying to not have a bad time, I absolutely recommend doing that and do not go 100% on anybody. But the narrower your player pool is, the more likely you are to win if it hits, because the worst feeling ever is when you were right about 5 of your plays, but your player pool was so watered down that you didn't get the right 5 plays into the same lineup. So you really need to take guys that you feel really good about and just work on building around them. Like if it's a 2-game slate, I don't mind if you lock 4 players and then just try to build around the rest, because even if you nail those 4 players that you locked, you still needed to get the ancillary pieces right. And it might come down to your Justice Hill in the flex, for example, if you binked or not. Last week's a perfect example. What kept me out of first place was Mecole Hardman. Mecole Hardman, I had the same lineup as first place, except for I had Mecole Hardman, and I forget which ancillary player that they had. It'll come back. Oh, Deontay Hardy. So it was Mecole Hardman versus Deontay Hardy. I had so many Chiefs 5x1s, but all of mine included Mecole, and I needed a 4x2 with Deontay Hardy. So that's my point. If you can just narrow down the players that you really care about, yeah, you might be all in the white by the end of the night, but you could also really nail that top spot.
And I need to call you like every Sunday morning or Saturday night and have you repeat that to me, because the year that I won 20 grand, and I almost every week I was getting a good sweat, was years that I had 4 or 5 guys who were between 60 and 80%. And some weeks were ugly, but on the week when you had a lot of lineups, and you're right, there's nothing more frustrating than being on 5 guys and then going through, seeing them go off, checking, and not having any of them all on all the same team. So the other thing you mentioned reminds me of the time I almost won a showdown slate. And it was when Kenyon Drake got traded to the Arizona Cardinals. And I put him in the captain spot, and he went absolutely nuclear. And I forget what, I think I had Andy Isabella. No, I had another Cardinal wide receiver who caught a touchdown, and I was like looking like I could win. And then I think Andy Isabella caught like his only long touchdown of his career, and he outscored my guy by like 6 points, and I came in tied for 4th instead of tied for 1st with only 2 other guys. So yeah, I love that. Absolutely love it. I'm going to guess your 100% guy is Brock Purdy.
Yeah.
Because my first thought when I thought about the slate was to go 100% Brock Purdy. Yeah. Especially with a narrower distribution pool. And then, right now he's showing at 30%. do you think how just awful he looked last week? I mean, he looked awful up until that last drive.
Yeah.
Do you think that will keep his ownership down, or do you think people will? I mean, do you think he's going to be the most owned quarterback on the slate just simply because the point total's higher?
He might technically be, but with Mahomes and Jackson both on the same slate as him, their name value alone makes them 25% guys. So I would say maybe you get 33 for Purdy, but you also probably get a good 25 for Jackson, 25 for Mahomes, and then the rest goes to golf. And most of the people playing golf are going to be people who wish that they could bring themselves to play Purdy. It is a viable option to try to leverage Purdy in the same price range, but it's people who are trying to be contrarian because you need to be contrarian, not because golf is a better option than Purdy. So Purdy's justified at about 33%.
Yeah, and I think, Goff on the road, I mean, it's not a make-believe thing. He just doesn't play as well on the road.
Yeah,
now,
and it's great defense too.
What's that? And
it's a great defense too.
Yeah. Although it's a great defense, I saw someone make a post last week about how the teams that have beaten San Francisco are the ones that can handle the pass rush. And the Lions are one of the better offensive lines in the league. I'm not going to play Goff. I'm just not.
Yeah.
And I could see this game getting away from the Lions. I a lot of times when I do this, I force at least two of the opposition in a majority, in way more than I normally would have more guys in that game. Yeah. I'm not so sure about that this week. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I like Purdy is because there's a lot of bringbacks for Detroit. You have a lot of options that aren't going to be super popular. We'll talk about them when we get to the other positions. But I see what you're saying. The only problem is, though, with the total, with there being such a disparity in the two totals, there's going to have to come scoring from somebody in the slate. And since both running backs are viable, I love to come back with a running back. If I'm not going to play the quarterback, then I'd like to play the running back because he has the best chance of being negatively correlated to the quarterback. Jahmyr Gibbs has only caught one touchdown pass, even though he's active in the passing game. So I do like being able to pick from one of the Lions, and then also on a Lions backs, and then also on a 2-game slate. I don't mind making a rule to make sure that you have 2 run backs, especially if you're betting on the total like I am. Betting on the Kansas City-Baltimore game going under, and then this game hitting 51, then you probably want to make sure you have at least, 6 players from this game, because you want to stack, probably triple stack Purdy, play 2 Detroit players. So 6. Yeah. So that's a lot, right? So you want to make sure that you get a lot of players from that game because you're betting that game hits the over.
All right. So the only other quarterback that I'm really considering going 100% on is Lamar. Mm-hmm. And listening to Ryan kind of, helped me there, because if he's going to throw for 300 and he runs for 60, and that game certainly has the potential to catch the other game. That's my thought. Is Lamar would be the other guy. That is the other guy that I'm considering going all in on.
That I'm over here laughing because I had the same thought, but that's because I'm in the Baltimore area and Lamar Jackson's my favorite player. So it was very difficult, trust me, to not just say, I'm just going to go 100%.
That can go against you.
But
when you're a fan, sometimes like I overcompensate for the Giants, right? Because I don't want to be that guy. Mm-hmm. If anything, I've erred on the side of being too negative on Giants. So, you got to be careful with that too.
Well, mine has come with overconfidence in Lamar's, not his passing ability, because pretty much everybody agrees now finally that he's an incredible passer. It's his target distribution is just so unpredictable. And what I always try to do is overcompensate on the narrative that Lamar Jackson is not a productive pocket passer. So I always lock in 3 receivers with him. Usually it's like a tight end. Usually it's like a tight end and then Nelson Aguilar. And then you have to pick between OBJ, Zay Flowers, and Rashad Bateman. That's usually what I go with. And I'm way overweight on Aguilar pretty much every time he scores a touchdown. So that's awesome. But what happens is Lamar never really brings 3 receivers with him. I always try to differentiate by stacking him with 3 receivers. So that's really my soft spot, is that I don't really know how to get different without stacking him with 3 receivers, but I know he's probably not going to get there with 3 receivers. So that's my crutch. Every Ravens slate is
an interesting way to do it would be just Lamar and Aguilar. And, if Aguilar actually scores 2 touchdowns and no one else gets close, and I mentioned in chat 1 week about Aguilar that, I thought he might be the answer. I mean, he really is an underrated guy, and one of the few guys who probably, even though he's done well, won't have any ownership. But let's get over to wide receiver next. Ryan, anything on quarterbacks?
No, I mean, nothing to add to the quarterback conversation. You guys covered it, and you know where I stand with Lamar, expecting a good game out of him.
Awesome. So, speaking of 100% Brandon Aiyuk, as we head over to the wide receiver position, we have 2 props from Ryan. And the first one is the said Mr. Aiyuk.
Yeah, Brandon Aiyuk, I'm going to take the over on his receiving yards. Right now, it's available at 80.5. I think there's probably a spot where you want to wait to place that prop because maybe it falls a little bit if we get word that Debo is active. I am sort of, like I said, I'm approaching this 49ers game as if whether Debo is active or not, he's going to have a reduced volume. And so I'm factoring that into my logic here. But I think the fact that he's active is going to force some people to adjust their thinking on these lines, and which might drive the number down here a little bit to 77 or 75 or something. So wait to bet this prop. But regardless of what happens with Debo, I'm on the over here, and we're sort of following the similar train of thought with McCaffrey that we talked about, but just going in reverse. Like we talked about with McCaffrey, Lions are a single high coverage team, and teams like to play single high coverage at elevated rates against the 49ers. So we're expecting a very high rate of single high coverage. So we got to look at, what do the 49ers do? Well, against single high coverage, it's much greater odds you've got a one-on-one matchup out there somewhere. And when it's Aiyuk, when they think they've got that one-on-one matchup out there, so if someone's on an island against him, that's like an automatic check in their offense. They're going to go to him, and they're going to attack downfield, which is why I'm on the yardage prop in particular, because we have the potential to have a 40-yard play or something like that out of him, which allows us to hit the over on a receiving yards prop when, maybe surprisingly he only gets 3 catches or something like that. So that's why I'm leaning towards the receiving yards, but the same logic applies if you wanted to bet the receptions as well. I think that's justified. So based on the fact that we think Debo is not going to play or limited, we know we're seeing single high coverage. We look at Ayuk's target share on the season. It's 25% against single high, 19% against 2 high. So already a pretty big difference there overall. But with Debo is not on the field, he sees a 22% target share against 2 high, basically the same as that 19%, but 37% against single high. He gets a huge jump, because Debo actually does see a decent, although he's not regularly used downfield, they will sometimes, if they can get a one-on-one matchup, use him to stretch the field. So you take that out of the equation, and Aiyuk is getting all of those opportunities now. So this one is pretty straightforward to me. It's a great matchup regardless, because of the fact that we're seeing a lot of single high coverage in this game. And if Debo is out of the game, it almost becomes too easy. I love the prop in that case. Think you're muted, Todd.
He is my favorite. Wouldn't be an episode with you guys if I didn't do that once. So I think Aiyuk's my favorite play in the slate. The Lions have been very susceptible. If you go 100% Aiyuk and you go 30% McCaffrey, 100% Purdy, I think you have leveraged the field pretty effectively while taking advantage of maybe 90% Aiyuk. And so I really, that's very tempting to me, because McCaffrey, there will be plenty of people who have that threesome, but not to that level, I don't think.
I should also mention too, I forgot to mention this, but we had basically this exact same conversation last week about Mike Evans and how the Buccaneers were going to attack that defense, and look what happened there.
Yeah. Yep. And I ended up around 45% Mike Evans, which is not bad. Actually, I was closer to 50. But again, he was my favorite play on the slate. A couple years ago, especially on a short slate, I would have been 80 or 90%. And it's like my crack. I just have been, since I started using the optimizer, it's, and you got to get over that fear of missing out, that FOMO. It's brutal. All right. So, and it's really bad when you get it right and you still lose money because you just pissed it all away.
Yeah.
All right. So you do have another prop for us, and it is the former best wide receiver in football, who is a shell of his former self, who everyone was talking about as the hot guy because they saved him for the playoffs last week, and then he ran less routes than he had all year. But you have him as a prop over on Odell Beckham. I am fascinated because I know you've got good reasoning.
Yeah, Odell Beckham over on his receiving yards, which is available at just 20.5. And the performance last week is obviously a factor here because it keeps that line really low, which is great for us. As I mentioned earlier, the Chiefs are likely to lean on cover one at a really high rate in this game, despite the fact that they're usually a too high cover team. They want to adjust. I mentioned how we saw them at a 39% rate of cover one against Justin Fields, obviously the most similar quarterback they've played in terms of overall skill set to Lamar Jackson. So we've got good reason to think we're going to see a lot of cover one in this game, which was a factor in our Lamar Jackson prop. In this case, when they're in cover one, Odell Beckham has seen a consistent boost in his usage all year. He's actually their second most targeted receiver. And, it makes sense, sort of like the Brandon Aiyuk conversation that we just had. He's the type of receiver that, even at this stage of his career, he's a good option in one-on-one situations, and they try to take advantage of that. If they think it's a one-on-one matchup for Odell, they're going to take some shots deep. He sees a 17% target share against cover one, and 35% of those targets are 20 or more yards downfield. Because of that, his yards per reception against cover one, 24.4 yards. So we're going to see cover one at a higher rate in this game, probably about a third of the time, roughly, maybe even a little bit higher than that. That means probably multiple opportunities for Odell Beckham to get down the field, multiple targets down the field. He's just got to catch one, and we hit the over on his total receiving yards prop. Now, obviously, you could use the exact same logic and bet the over on his longest reception. That's completely justified. If you're choosing between the two, I prefer the longest, the overall receiving yards, because that line is so low. Like I said, 20.5 yards. You could easily do that in one catch, but you also leave yourself open to the possibility that he has 3 catches for 25 yards. He's had stat lines like that this season as well. So even though that's not what we're expecting the game to play out as, it's on the table at least. And so you give yourself another way to win the prop by playing the receiving yards rather than just playing that longest reception, although playing both totally justified.
All right. I like it. And Adam, we have 4 or 5 players in the 40 to 50% range. You mentioned how ARSB, Amon-Ra St. Brown, is the only real high price guy. The other chalky guys are Jamison Williams and Josh Reynolds of the Lions. So it's really interesting. 3 chalky Lions on the road. Rashee Rice of the Chiefs, who is banged up. And then slightly under that is Brandon Aiyuk. I'm curious, of that list, anybody jump out as incorrect for you, and anyone that you just say that's 100% guy for me?
Well, I think Brandon Aiyuk's ownership right now is fugazi because we don't know what Deebo Samuel's going to do, and that's going to matter a lot. I will say anybody who has made the commitment that I have to play 100% Brock Purdy. Go to your optimizer, lock Brock Purdy, do nothing else. Tell it to build you 20 lineups and see if you find a single one that does not have Brock Purdy, Brandon Aiyuk, George Kittle, and Christian McCaffrey. So if you think you're going to get your leverage on your main stack, good luck. You're not going to have it unless you're going 100% on Jawan Jennings. But I will say we have our first callback of the show since I started one here. If you recall, nailed it with Dak Prescott, but I elected to lock CD Lamb, and I would have made a lot of money if I played almost anybody but CD Lamb in some of those stacks. So I think if Deebo Samuel does play, I am more comfortable locking Brandon Aiyuk and playing 0 Deebo Samuel. And of course, Deebo Samuel could score a short touchdown or something like that. But that would be the only way I feel like I'd be okay with that leverage, having a teeny bit of leverage. If Deebo Samuel sits, it's really hard to lock Brandon Aiyuk, especially since that allows more opportunity for someone like Jawan Jennings. So if Deebo Samuel sits, I'll probably be like 70% on Brandon Aiyuk and then make sure that I'm sprinkling in a bunch of like Ronnie Bell and Jawan Jennings and
I
hoping
was
that I
just going
can
to
break
ask you
up
about
that.
Ronnie Bell.
Yeah,
It's
to
funny
try
that
to
you
break
mentioned
up.
it because I think you and I both like him.
Yeah, he was fine. I mean, he didn't up until that show that we did, he'd never panned out for me, but he was always in a bunch of my lineups. And then I think he did catch a few catches in that show that we did.
The Ravens and the Chiefs wide receivers are lower owned, but for good reason. In a 2 games, other than Rashee Rice, in a 2-game slate, anyone from that group, we've talked about Aguilar a little bit. Is there anyone we missed, and is there anyone that you're just not interested at ownership?
I think that the only person that stands out a little bit is Zay Flowers, and I know I've been let down by Zay Flowers so many times this year. Not that he hasn't been productive, he's just never been productive enough. I think the only 20-point game where he actually worked at captain for me, he caught a touchdown, and I think it was in London. Other than that, he's good for 6 catches, 70 yards, something like that. So when you're playing Showdown, it's really hard to get him in the captain spot and ever actually get a captain performance for him. But when you're playing on the 2-game slate, you're almost playing to just it's like you're kind of playing bingo. You just need to hit every spot, right? You almost just want 10 points or more at every spot, except for, of course, like your quarterback and maybe your running back one. So when you're doing that and you have a guy like Zay Jones, it's like, hey, I'll probably get 13 and I might get 20 out of them. And there's not looking to be a lot of run on him. Yeah, somebody like Zay Jones really does stand out for me, especially if Lamar Jackson's going to have a really good passing performance. I don't think it's going to come because of Mark Andrews. I think it'll probably be because of Zay Flowers. Sorry, not Zay Jones.
Yeah, who is a free agent, Zay Jones. So already transitioning to best ball. All right. So are there any off the board? Wide receiver is typically the place where you find that off the board. Is Aguilar your main off the board guy, or is there someone else?
Yeah, with Odell Beckham's route participation going down a little bit, I think that it's probably due to Nelson Aguilar overperforming, and he actually has overperformed much of the season relative to expectations. It hasn't looked like a lot, but when you're the 3rd wide receiver for the Ravens, now I guess that does mean a little bit different this year than in years past, but still, when you're a 3rd wide receiver for the Ravens, your bar set pretty low, and he has overperformed. So I do think that was indicative of Aguilar and not so much indicative of how Odell Beckham's performed. So I probably am going to go there.
So I'm going off the board a little bit here. I just kind of had this thought. So Warren Sharp tweeted this week about the referee for this game and how he is a big away referee. And, a lot of people on Twitter took that as us saying that Taylor Swift was the reason that Roger Goodell wants the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. I wouldn't put it past him personally. But, I think we've had enough conspiracy theories. But, I mean, does that make either one of you want to just say, hey, you know what? If Mahomes is going to be, lower owned and his receivers are going to be lower owned. Ryan, any thoughts on? Do you buy into the narrative that the NFL wants the Chiefs in the Super Bowl?
I mean, who knows? Maybe it's a factor in how they place the ref, but even though the refs are always a factor in the game, they're not. They don't have the ultimate control over the game still. And so the Ravens, if they come out,
But they do have the script.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
If they can come out and they're able to control the ball on the ground, then they're probably going to win this game. It's probably going to be a low scoring game, right? Regardless of the refs. And, if they, or maybe it's just a low scoring game and, one or two penalties go the Chiefs' way and the Chiefs end up winning 21-17 or something like that. But I don't think that the refs have any control over the fact that the Ravens might be able to dominate this game on the ground, might be able to get a couple big pass plays through the air as the Chiefs are playing more man coverage like we talked about. And so, yeah, if it's really close, the refs are going to make a difference, but it has to be close first. And the refs don't control that.
Adam, any thoughts on this, the latest scandal that is brewing on Twitter?
Well, actually, I do have, no, not on the latest scandal that's brewing, but I do have a conspiracy theory if we're going to go with that. I actually like Mecole Hardman a lot. And on the latest New Heights podcast, Travis Kelce took full responsibility for Mecole Hardman. Forget about the fact that Mecole Hardman has made a billion boneheaded plays exactly like that one. This one apparently was in fact not his fault. Travis Kelce said that he did not hold his block, and he is very sorry for Mecole Hardman. If you saw in the game what happened because you were sweating him very nervously like I was, Rashee Rice got hurt and Mecole Hardman was the direct representative. I knew that meant that it was going to be a trick play to Mecole Hardman because earlier in the game when Mecole Hardman came in, they ran a fake jet sweep with Mecole Hardman. So that told me when he came in the game next time in the, within the 5-yard line, he's probably going to get the ball. Sure enough, he did get the ball. If he scored a touchdown, I'm making $1 trillion, whatever it was going to be. He didn't, but I do think that in this game, they're going to be comfortable going back to him and not giving him the doghouse treatment.
If I had a soundboard, when you mentioned the name Mecole Hardman, you would have gotten a car crash sound bite. But alas, I do not. And we move on to tight end. George Kittle is almost 50% owned. The normal rule, Adam, for Kittle is you fade him at high ownership and play and you hit and you smash at low ownership. But with Debo either out or limited, 50% ownership. Your thoughts on him on a 2-game slate at that kind of ownership?
That's pretty fair. You're almost not going to have a chance if you're playing Brock Purdy like we talked about a moment ago. It doesn't really matter. The only thing you could do is lock them all in. I mean, I legitimately might lock Brock Purdy, George Kittle, Brandon Aiyuk, and Christian McCaffrey. And then I'll create like some rules for the Lions bringbacks and such. But yeah, 50% might be 50% too low. So I actually don't think that's crazy high for this slate.
All right. Mark Andrews back from injury. Right now he's showing low ownership. Do you think that sub 10% ownership will hold? Are you intrigued by playing him at that ownership? And would you consider playing him and Isaiah Likely in the same lineup?
I don't think you have enough there to play them both. I was actually going to ask Ryan and go off of script a little bit. Do you think that they're going to run more 2 tight end sets than they'd be comfortable with just because of the fact that Isaiah Likely earned the right to stay on the field?
I think it's plausible, especially if the game script breaks, that they can be relatively run heavy if it's close or they're playing with a lead throughout. Certainly plausible. And, I'd mentioned last week how I kind of liked Isaiah Likely despite thinking that Andrews might play. And I really feel the same way again, because his performance last week, that only increases their confidence in him, right? Like he's on a nice streak here. They're starting to feel really comfortable with him.
Well, the reason I ask is because Isaiah Likely is definitely more talented than actually probably any option outside of Zay Flowers. And he's going to be relegated to a backup role. That seems quite unfortunate for the Ravens. So I don't know that what I'm worried about though is that they've found so much like success with such a different identity with Todd Monken. Do you want to change that going into the AFC Championship? That's what I'm worried about. If you're just going to get all of your players on the field and Todd Monken's an excellent offensive coordinator, then maybe you find a way to get Isaiah Likely on the field. But if you've been doing so well, I think it probably makes more sense to actually just have a higher snap share for Isaiah Likely and then bring Mark Andrews in more of a package role. If we all think back a little bit, when Mark Andrews started ascending as one of the league's best tight end, he was doing it on a 40% snap share. So it's not uncommon for him to play less than 50% of the snaps. With that being said, you're really throwing darts. It's hard to know what they're going to do with them, but it really might be a nice spot to get 60% of the snaps for Isaiah Likely and have 15% ownership, probably 10% ownership on him.
Yeah, I just looked up some numbers real quick.
Hold on 1 second, Ryan. I just want to say that, I agree. I could, we've seen this again. Guys come back from real serious injuries early, and they play, but they don't play nearly what you think they might play. The more we've talked about this, the more, you don't have to twist my arm hard to play Isaiah Likely.
Right.
So Ryan, I interrupted you. I want to hear your what you were going to say. And I also meant to ask you when we were talking George Kittle, your thoughts on Mr. Kittle. So why don't you handle both of those?
Yeah, I just looked at some stats real quick. Obviously, two tight end formations has never been a staple of Monken's offense. But they did use it occasionally this year. It looks like they had 71 dropbacks in two tight end formations. And Lamar Jackson was very good. 73% completion rate, 8.3 yards per attempt, and 30% of their attempts were 10 or more yards downfield, which is pretty much in line with his season averages. So they definitely have some stuff in the playbook to do that. So if in this matchup you wanted to shift to more of that, I think that would certainly make sense since we know that they have confidence in Likely. And it's also not uncommon for teams to lean a little bit more heavy in one unexpected area of the playbook in playoff games. It happens all the time in championship games and Super Bowls where teams will just do something different just to be different in the biggest game of the year and try to catch you off guard in an area where they feel confident in, but they know you haven't prepared for fully either. So yeah, to sprinkle him into some lineups a little bit more than you might otherwise expect, knowing that that's a possibility, that seems reasonable.
All right. Let's hit quickly on two other very talented tight ends, Adam, that are out there in Travis Kelce and Laporta of Detroit.
Sure.
They're both going to have ownership, but to me, if Kittle's 50, that's another reason that I'm less Isaiah Likely to go 100 on Brock Purdy.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on those two, and then Ryan, if you have a thought on the matchup for either one of them, if one of them has a better matchup.
Yeah, so I like Sam Laporta in the flex a lot. 5,400 is not super cheap for a tight end. So getting him in the flex will give you a little bit of leverage for your 49er stacks. That's something I'd be interested in doing is like running one of the 49er running backs back and then putting Sam Laporta in the flex. I'm interested in that. But also Travis Kelce's price when he hasn't really warranted that price is a pretty nice way to gain some leverage too, with George Kittle being a far better projection at 1,300 less and significantly more owned. It's a good spot for Travis Kelce, especially since Rashee Rice seems to be a little bit banged up. And you don't really see good Kelce games and good Rashee Rice games at the same time. I know Kelce games seem to have been few and far between recently, and the ascension of Rice kind of has gone alongside Travis Kelce taking a step back. But that's just more reason to say it's really hard. And that's why there's not a lot of ownership on Patrick Mahomes, right? Because he only has two receivers he can trust, and both of them don't perform well at the same time. So all that to say, Rashee Rice is really high owned. George Kittle are really high owned. Well, Travis Kelce is going to be leveraged off of both of them.
Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, both of those guys are sort of tough to figure out. I didn't really talk at all about the Chiefs' offense, and part of the reason for that is the Ravens defense is just so versatile. It's tough to find a trend. It's tough to anticipate what they want to do. They're sort of, in terms of like the coverage scheme, they're basically 50-50, two high, single high, and they can swing wildly from game to game. Same thing with their fronts. They're multiple front defense. If they want to stack the box, they can do it. If they want to play with the light box, they can do it. So it's tough to make predictions. And so if they come into this game and just with the game plan of we're taking away Kelsey, they can do it because they've lined up in those formations that will make it harder to get him the ball. If they take a different approach, they could do that too. So maybe Kelsey has a huge game. It's just I don't like playing against the Ravens defense, not just because it's good, but because it's hard to even pin down the trend. And with Laporta, it's a factor of the line. I mean, this is the best defense he's played in a few weeks. It's going to be tough for him. I mean, it's a big step up in competition in terms of what he's facing in coverage in the middle of the field against the 49ers. That's a tough matchup. Also, I forgot to mention Kittle. You asked me about him before, and I did want to just quickly share some numbers because we've talked about it with the other 49ers pass catchers, how the Debo injury potentially affects him. I didn't want to go down this prop, but I do think there is some evidence that Kittle benefits from Debo being out. He sees a 22% target share overall against single high coverage, and it's 28% without Debo. So he gets a boost. I didn't take this prop though,
but
because
it's not as big of a boost as I think the field thinks it is.
Exactly. It's a boost, but everyone is expecting a boost and the props are reflecting a boost. And so like, I feel like the reaction to it is sort of in line with what it matches up. Like the line is appropriate. The expectation you're seeing in the DFS roster share going up, like it's already being reflected. So I can't really come down on one side or the other with him, but I did just want to share those numbers since we've talked about all the other Niners pass catchers.
Awesome. All right, last question for the show. I'm going to throw it to our showdown expert. We normally don't cover defense, but on a 2-game slate, I am very curious to your thoughts on how to play defense on a slate like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Defense is the only one that I will just sprinkle in as my lineup fits. I don't put a lot of attention to it. I don't pick the defense and then build the lineup. I pick lineups that I like and I will throw the defense in that fits afterwards. Just do not like really being overweight on a defense because I hate when that's the reason that I didn't bink because the rest of my lineup was fantastic and I missed on the defense. I think there's viability in all 4 defenses for very different reasons. So maybe not 25% of each. There are better ones than others, but I will kind of just build out my 20 lineups. I won't touch anything in the optimizer that tells my optimizer what to do with defense. And if I see 70% of one defense, I will clip that down a good bit. I'm not going to be over 50% on any of the defenses.
All right. That is awesome information, guys. It has really been a tremendous pleasure for me to work with both of you during these 3 weeks. We will have a show next week. We're finalizing exactly what we're going to do. Probably get some early looks at props and early ownership, and then we'll come back the following week with a more detailed, especially with props. Things early can change a lot, so I'm kind of excited about that opportunity. We really appreciate you joining us. Remember, get a 75% discount on our weekly NFL package. Use the promo code 75OFF at www.sharpfootballanalysis.com, and we will see you next week.